I've got a great guest on the show before 10:30, and he's called Dominic Selwood. He's a historian, amongst so many other things, and he's written a fantastic book. And part of his research, he had to look at objects, documents, that sort of thing, right across the whole of the country, and you'll find out more about that soon. My guest on the show right now has been studying, he's been researching artefacts and documents right across the British Isles. And humans have inhabited the British Isles for almost 1 million years. Since the Stone Age, we've expressed ourselves with art. And once writing arrived in the 1st century, everything then became documented, from emotional experiences to impressions, impressions of life, I suppose. And although a little of that remains today, what has been found and studied tells us a huge amount about the people who have lived throughout the ages. Now, this is something Dominic Selwood explores in his new book. It's called Anatomy of a Nation, a history of British identity in 50 documents. So we had a chat recently, and I wanted to find out from the outset what prompted his interest in history.
I always loved history at school. When I was about 9 or 10, I remember doing, colouring in Knights in Armour and thinking that was absolutely brilliant. And then I fell completely out of love with history as a teenager because it was all about sort of Bismarck and Austrian politics. It just sounded incredibly dull to me. But then I got back into it again at university and went to go and do it for graduate study and went back actually to the Crusades and Knights in Armour and just been absolutely passionate about it ever since. Then I ended up being a barrister and a journalist, but I came back to history then sort of slightly later in life, and have just been doing it now for about the last 10 years, really seriously for newspapers and so on, and really loving it.
Tell me about your latest book. It's called Anatomy of a Nation, a history of British identity, but you've done this in 50 objects. So what sort of things have you been looking at?
Well, it started really, I was thinking about the idea when all the debates were happening around Brexit, because obviously we were witnessing two really different views of our future, and I couldn't help thinking, actually, these are also connected to two different views of our past. And then when I started seeing all the arguments around some of the statues that some people want to take down, I kind of thought, this is really interesting. What is it saying about who we are as Britons these days? And, what our values are and what we think about our history. So I started thinking about it in terms of how can we get as close to the people of the past as possible to really understand what they thought about their times rather than just what we think about it. And it struck me that documents are one of the best ways to get there. So I looked for 50 things basically with writing on, whether it's inscriptions of axe heads and daggers on Stonehenge, or it's paintings, or it's album covers for music, or it's more traditional documents like books or royal charters. But I really tried to stay away from the traditional stuff that you would expect. And so I made a lot of effort to try and find things from the archives that were a bit unusual or told stories about people that no one had ever heard of, but that were really representative of what was going on in the past. So it was huge fun to find them all.
I bet it was. So you're using your journalistic head, if you like, to delve and investigate. And I like the sound of that. Did that mean you spent many times in darkened attics of libraries and museums having a little rummage around?
Yeah, absolutely. And that really is some of the best fun of it. And that's when I was a researcher back at university, I used to love doing that, going into castles and crypts and archives, because you never know what you're going to find. Yeah. Often these things are not properly labelled and they're not written up. So, there are just some real joys. So, for example, one of the favourite things that I found was the first Valentines card. We think of Valentine's Day now as this big international celebration, but it started in England, in medieval England, and the first person ever to write a Valentine's card was a woman called Marjorie Bruce, and she was from Norfolk, and she wrote one in 1477, and we've still got it. I mean, just amazing things to have.
Oh my God, and what did it say? Who was she writing to?
She was writing to her fiancé, who she was very worried because her fiancé's father thought that her dowry wasn't big enough. And so she was trying to get her fiancé to come and stay for a weekend so that she and her mother could sort of persuade him that he could then persuade his father. But it's a really tender letter. And, she sort of pours out her heart. She doesn't have much choice in life if he doesn't marry her. And he's a gentleman and, she needs to make a good connection. If she doesn't, she's only got a couple of years and she's done. It's quite a long letter, actually. It's not just a card. It's got their whole backstory in it, which makes it incredibly interesting.
Gosh, and did it work? Did you manage to persuade him to come over for the weekend? Do we know that?
Work. He did come over for the weekend. They did get married. We've got later letters between them as well for the rest of their lives, and they had a really loving, nice marriage. It's a great story.
And I think when we think about history in schools or if we watch on TV, it's often famous people, isn't it? It's famous battles, famous noblemen and women. But when you're finding something about real people, that's the difference, isn't it?
It makes all the difference, really, because battles are sort of so abstract, and I think British school children get so turned off history, but I've learned all these battles.
It's
Britain's
boring,
always
isn't it?
at war.
Yeah.
So actually, it's not really that interesting. As you say, it's the people that really bring it to life. So, for example, the plague. I mean, we're all interested in the plague at the moment because of what's going on with COVID. And there are lots of, royal proclamations about it, and there are these statistics that are released, every day and every week, and the number of people dying. But I'm not actually that interested by that. There's a wonderful piece of graffiti on a pillar in a church, which dates from the 1350 plague, from one of the victims who survived. And the comment of this person, we don't know if it was a man or a woman, but they wrote in Latin, but they were saying that, the pandemic had been pitiable and savage and violent, and only the dregs of the people have survived. All the good ones are gone. And when you get those kind of really personal insights as to what was happening in history, that just really brings it all to life for me.
Oh, definitely. You want to know how they lived. And I remember at school, Dominic, I don't know if you remember when they push in the big TV into the school hall, and on a Thursday morning we would all troop in and sit there on the parquet floor, and your legs would be numb because the floor was really hard, and we'd watch a programme called How They Used to Live.
Yeah.
And that was about the people of, I don't know, they'd pick a year and then you'd look at the families of that time, and I loved that. But as I say, when we're talking about battles and dates and times, I was bored to tears, but it was the people that gripped me every single time.
I think that's right. And I think you want a human connection because, history, borders moving, armies going somewhere. Fine. It has a role, and obviously it's important to the overall outcome of things. But actually, I think what we really get engaged by, and particularly, as you say, when you're younger, is the idea that people had very similar thoughts and lives to our own. They just lived in slightly different contexts, but they often faced, very similar issues. And then suddenly the past comes alive and you can connect with it, and it's meaningful.
Definitely.
And when you think about your own families as well, and previous generations and so on, understanding how they lived, I think it really brings it all to life.
And even that graffiti, we don't know if man or woman, but we know at that time they were having huge struggles, and that just unpicks things slightly, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And getting things in people's own words, I think, is always so much better than coming up with theories afterwards. And it's always really surprising. The world is much more colourful than you think. Another one of my favourite things in the book is the King James Bible. We hold it up as this incredibly sort of important thing in English literature. It's coming out at the same time as Shakespeare, and it kind of sets the gold standard for Jacobean language, which we still kind of think of as a high point of English. But yet, one of the guys who wrote it, one of the translators, was a chap called Richard Dutch Thompson, but Dutch was his nickname. And they said someone from the time said that he was dissolute, he was profane, he was drunken, he never went to bed one night sober. And at the same time, he was working on a collection of translations of some very, very rude Roman poetry. I always wonder what would happen if he'd taken the wrong sheet of paper along to a Bible meeting. But, it's like the contrast between this sort of, this weighty, austere Bible and this really kind of quite fascinating, fast-living guy who was one of the translators.
Gosh, he sounds great at parties. Yeah, sounds it.
Yeah.
He'd be a hoot. More from my guest, historian Dominic Selwood, in the next 15 minutes or so, and we'll find out about some of the artefacts that he's been studying from here in the Northeast and what that tells us about the people who lived here hundreds of years ago. My guest on the show at the moment is a historian, Dominic Selwood. Now, we were chatting a little earlier about some of the fascinating things he's discovered whilst writing his latest book. It's called Anatomy of a Nation, a history of British identity in 50 documents. So what are those documents? Where has he been delving? Well, I asked him to tell me about just some of the objects that he's researched here in the Northeast.
Obviously, the history of the Northeast is incredibly rich. And in fact, after sort of Stonehenge, one of the first documents in the book we have when writing comes to Britain properly is from Vindolanda, the Roman fort on the Stanegate, where we have a card. And it's a party invitation from a young woman. She's probably in her teens or early 20s because she's got a young child. So in that age, we would know that would probably make her quite young. And she's an army wife. And we don't know quite where she's based, but she's somewhere near Vindolanda because she sends this card to her best friend at Vindolanda and says, please, please, please come to my party. You'll make the day so much more enjoyable for me, if you're there. And so, it's incredible we've got that. Not only has it survived, for 2,000 years, but, it tells us that people were just like they are now, wanting their friends to come for their birthday parties, probably a bit bored, dangerous world as well, travelling around there, but it was worth it for a party. But it's incredible because although most of the card is written by a professional writer, by a scribe, actually the greeting at the end, when she says, nice things to her friends, she's written in her own handwriting. So that tells us that a teenage woman in the Northeast in the year about 100 was able to write.
Yes.
And she's got good handwriting. It's very clear. You can still read it now. And not only is it the oldest woman's handwriting in Britain, which is quite amazing, it's also the oldest woman's handwriting anywhere in the entire Roman world, which is incredible when you think how big the Roman world was and how small Britain was in comparison. But, that's a really, really extraordinary thing to have survived.
And when you're studying something like this, when you're lucky enough to see something as rare as this, what precautions are in place to protect it? I'm sure that you can't go in and just start picking it up and having a look.
Definitely. And, and the world has really moved on in that regard. 50 years ago or so, you could have just walked into these places and, picked the things up and put them there and had a cup of tea with them. Now people are much, much, much more careful. Some objects you simply can't handle. You have to sort of look at under glass or in boxes. Other things you can handle. Sometimes rules change a bit. Some archives really like you to wear gloves so that you don't get the things, all sort of greasy with your fingers. But actually more and more people are saying actually the gloves make you a bit clumsy and you can damage things. Your fingertips are actually much more sensitive. And also the oils in your fingers are really good for the old vellum and parchment because it stops it drying out and helps actually prolong its life. So more and more now all the major archives do let you handle things. But of course, you need to be careful.
And while you're handling something like that, Dominic, is there a moment of, right, I'll just keep still. I don't want to sneeze and it rips into 1,000 pieces, or I'll drop something. Yeah. Oh, I don't know if I'd be able to cope with that.
Oh, I know the feeling that this has survived for so long, and if you mess it up, it's suddenly going to be gone. That is quite a scary thought. But often you just get so lost in the document, you forget about it. I was going through Thomas Cromwell, who's famous for all these Wolf Hall stories by Hilary Mantel, but going through his diaries in which he's quite coldly setting out which people he's going to have murdered because he was not a nice person. And you're reading these things, you just think, crumbs, this is the only copy of this in the world. This is his original handwriting, and if I sneeze or it falls off the desk and tears or something, that would be really pretty disastrous. But yeah, you get used to it after a while.
There's another lady from the northeast who features in the book, and that's Margaret Cavendish, Lady Newcastle. Now, she has got a fascinating story. She was quite ahead of her time, I understand.
She's amazing, and actually she's becoming a bit better known now, which is brilliant. When the Civil War broke out in 1642, she was a committed royalist. So she ran off to Oxford to go and join Charles's court. And in no time at all, she was made lady-in-waiting to the Queen. She was very lucky. And she went off to Europe with the Queen, where she met Lord Newcastle and married him. And he'd been a royal commander and bankroller and had been very instrumental in Charles's army, but was forced to go to the continent when Charles wasn't doing so well. But she really comes into her own because she spends her time between England and the continent as a writer, and she writes stories, she writes poems, she writes essays, she writes scientific essays. And she comes back to England to get her husband's lands back. And she publishes this amazing collection of sort of poetry and stories. And, England at the time under Cromwell, it's like, Gilead in The Handmaid's Tale. There's no partying, there's no drinking, there's no singing, there's no theatre, there's no nothing. It's really strict, tight-laced country. And she's writing these poems about going dancing, going out drinking, going out flirting. She was absolutely irrepressible. And she was a very uncompromising person. I mean, she cross-dressed. She was seen as outlandish in her day. She was incorrigible socially. She was always being far too forward with people. She was known for swearing liberally. But also, as a skilled scientist, she was invited to the Royal Society. She was the first woman invited to the Royal Society to watch demonstrations of experiments. And she gave her thoughts and comments afterwards. They all commented, how fascinating her thoughts were, and they had great debates together. So she's one of those, extraordinary people who pops out for being so ahead of her time in so many ways. Not only, clearly a sort of proto-feminist in some ways. She does talk about, women's agendas and the role of women in society and what they can be doing and how they're seen. And yet at the same time, she just has this exuberance about her, and she really lives her life. She's an extraordinary character.
She sounds great. I think I'd like to go out with her on the Raz. I think she'd have a great night out, don't you, Dominic?
Her and the Dutch guy from the King James Bible, and I think you've got a really good party.
We've got a good party going on there. Brilliant. Now, after you've written a book like this, do you find there's specific people you want to delve in further into their backstory?
Yeah, all of them actually, because you just get these snapshots when you start, and then you just end up going further and further and further in. So Isaac Newton is another fascinating one, because we have this vision of him as the father of physics and one of the most important people in developing experimental science and in the age of rationality. But actually, the more you get into his background, he was so into mystical Christianity. He was a really, really intense Christian. He thought God was sending him secret messages in the Bible and that he was one of God's chosen prophets. And he spent, as much of his life trying to find Bible codes and things in the Bible, or looking at the sacred geography of King Solomon's temple or other ancient buildings from the olden world, thinking that they had mysteries of the universe, sewn into them. And so when he died, he was working on a book about the temples and palaces of the ancient world. To him, that was just as important as the physics and the maths. They were all ways of understanding, God's incredible creation in his mind. So yes, the more you delve into people, they're kind of almost never what you seem. They just come into 3D as you look at them more and more.
Well, what are you working on now?
I'm thinking I want to do something next. I'm getting some ideas together. I'm not sure if it's going to be history or be another novel. I wanted it to have something to do with books, probably, and with magic and witches. And of course, the Northeast has this incredible heritage of books. All of those Anglo-Saxon books, wonderful ones being produced at Jarrow and Lindisfarne. And I can also see some Vikings coming in, and that also is quite a Northeastern story. So yes, I would love to.
That's Dominic Selwood there. You can find out more about the work that Dominic is doing at his website. So it's dominicselwood.com, and his latest book, widely available in bookshops and online. And a really interesting, lush fella to have a chat with.